As a sponsor in the family class sponsorship application, there are many requirements and conditions that you must abide by. If these requirements or conditions are not met, there can be unexpected consequences for the sponsor in the future. As a result, it is extremely important for the sponsor to be aware of these requirements and conditions and how long they will be in place for. Therefore, in this video, I will explain what an undertaking entails, what happens when a sponsor is unable to fulfill the conditions of the undertaking, and the consequences that come as a result of the failure to fulfill these conditions. An undertaking is a contract signed by the sponsor and the sponsored applicant, indicating that the sponsor will be responsible for the sponsored applicant for a minimum of 3 years. The undertaking then becomes a legal contract with the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration and is lawfully binding. The responsibility of the sponsor is essentially financial responsibility for the sponsored applicant and support for that individual for the entire support duration. From the moment that the undertaking is signed, the sponsor is responsible for any support that the sponsored applicant needs, such as basic needs, food, shelter, and clothing. By having this responsibility, the sponsor is ensuring that the sponsored applicant will not need any social assistance from the Canadian government. Consequently, if the sponsored applicant does receive any social assistance from the Canadian government, the sponsor will be responsible to pay back any and all fees to the Canadian government. It is important to note that the undertaking takes place and begins on the day that the sponsored applicant arrives in Canada as a permanent resident. As previously mentioned, the length of the undertaking for spousal sponsorship applications is 3 years from the day that the sponsored applicant becomes a permanent resident in Canada and successfully arrives in the country. One of the most crucial consequences of not fulfilling the conditions of the undertaking is legal action taken towards the sponsor and any co-signers on the undertaking. This legal action would be pursued by the Canadian government. This is a possibility and does not always occur if you do not fulfill the conditions of the undertaking. However, it is extremely important to note that this may be possible. Thus, you should take this into consideration. Furthermore, if the sponsored applicant receives any social assistance from the Canadian government, then the provincial or federal government will then recover the costs from the sponsor. Consequently, the sponsor will no longer be able to sponsor anyone in the future until this debt is paid. The sponsor will be adequately notified by the Canadian government the moment that they receive social assistance. Additionally, they will be informed of how much debt is accumulating every month until the debt is paid. It is important to note that the sponsor's financial responsibility over the sponsored applicant is a binding commitment and is indicated by a written contract, which would be the undertaking. The undertaking does not change even if the sponsor's circumstances change. For instance, if the sponsor loses their employment and does no longer make the same funds as before, they are still financially responsible for the sponsored applicant for the 3 years. In other words, no matter what, the undertaking cannot be modified, revoked, or cancelled at any point in time by the sponsor once the sponsored applicant has gained permanent residency in Canada and has successfully arrived within the country. Furthermore, an undertaking cannot be cancelled even if the sponsored applicant receives Canadian citizenship or if the marriage is dissolved. Therefore, the sponsorship, including the undertaking, will remain in effect. Conclusively, it is extremely important and vital to the spousal sponsorship application that the sponsor understands and abides by the conditions and the requirements of the sponsorship and the undertaking. Thus, they must also abide by the length of the undertaking, which is a minimum of 3 years. It is essential that you have taken all of the aforementioned factors and information into consideration if you plan on sponsoring your spouse to Canada for permanent residency. Here at Acromion Associates, we have dealt with many different immigration matters, and we have helped many of our clients reunite with their spouses in Canada through the spousal sponsorship application. If you believe that you may be eligible, please contact us. With Acromion Associates, there's always a way.